not too much of an expert in this field. I pay diligent attention to TED Talks. And I believe it was Bill Gates was talking about burning depleted uranium as a possible option. Now, I haven't heard much since then. What is the field of thought on that at the moment?
So I mentioned actually very briefly a startup called Terra, which is a company based in just outside Seattle in Washington that has received fairly large amounts of startup capital from Gates, and the principal and others, quite a few others, and the principal. Well, one of the design principles of that technology is indeed to use depleted uranium which natural uranium contains 0.711% of the fissile isotope uranium-235. We have lots of uranium sitting around the country, or just in a couple of locations around the country, that have less than 0.711% of U-235. These are, in some sense, the waste products from uranium enrichment activities. And one of the design principles of the Terra Power reactor is to use that essentially waste material to convert the much more abundant U-238 isotopes in that material to fissionable or fissile plutonium in the reactor, not removing it from the reactor, but to do all of this in the reactor and basically have a thing that I mentioned before but didn't use these words, a nuclear battery that you charge with this waste material, set it off in some sense, and then it operates for its lifetime on the conversion of the waste material to plutonium. So that's the concept. I believe a lot of this work is being done, as you might expect, in a proprietary way, so we don't have all of the details in the public domain. I believe that it's a very serious development program. The company is certainly being very intelligent in how it uses research and development capabilities around the country. The company has decided that it cannot and will not build the first full-scale demonstration reactor of this type in the United States, mainly because of what it sees as an adverse regulatory environment. And so Gates and others have been going around the world basically discussing the possibility of building demonstration reactors in other countries, China being seemingly the front runner at the moment. But that program is moving ahead. There are many others, some more serious, some less serious. I think one would probably have to consider that a serious effort with serious resources and intelligent leadership.
Thank you. I got a question. I can yell it loudly. No, I can't.
Richard, if you were to connect your first part of your talk to the second part of your talk, do you believe that the innovation necessary in the nuclear field can happen without the structure that you outlined in the first? Is it already underway, and is there enough velocity and capacity there to build the next generation of nuclear without further intervention from some new creation?
Well, it's a very good question, and there is a surprising amount of innovative activity underway around the world, and even in the United States, bubbling up. But these projects or these programs will run into the problem that I identified in the first part of the discussion, which is the difficulty of organizing and financing these demonstration and early adoption projects. And this is true in nuclear, it's true in many other energy areas. And I do think that that we're going to have to come up with a different scheme. Maybe it's not the scheme that I showed. And by the way, it's quite interesting because many of the people who have looked at that scheme say, this looks quite interesting, maybe it'll work. The people who don't like it are, in general, are people in the nuclear field, because they have grown accustomed to federally driven research and development and demonstration projects. And I think a number of people are, look at a scheme which takes the responsibility for decisions on demonstration and early adoption projects away from the congressional appropriations process, away from the federal system for deciding on these projects, which is the way we've done this in the nuclear field for decades, and takes it somewhere else. I think a number of people feel that that's not a great idea. My own view is that probably even in the nuclear area, we're going to have to do something like that. And I'll give you an example. Why? I mentioned that there's a lot of interest now in small modular reactors. Many of us have heard about this, and we have a lot of work going on in our department on this and many others. The Department of Energy recently announced a $500 million program to support development, and in particular licensing the development of new regulations for this new class of small modular light water reactors. And it does seem appropriate for the government to be engaged in supporting the development of new licensing and new regulations for new technologies. People might argue with that, but it seems to me not an inappropriate use of federal funds. But the likelihood is that the first, if indeed we get to the point where we start building the first commercial reactors of this type, they will not be economically competitive relative to the incumbent basically natural gas-fired power plants. And this is true for solar, wind, it's true for all of these new technologies. It's very hard for them to compete. The hope is that they'll come down the learning curve and eventually will compete against the incumbent technologies. But how are we going to finance that period where the costs exceed those of the incumbent technologies? If you do the arithmetic, you see that those financing costs are a lot greater than anything that could conceivably be paid for out of the federal budget. Especially today, but even if we weren't facing the fiscal constraints that we are today, the amounts that are needed, so we have to find resources from somewhere else. And they have to be, I don't know whether it's okay to use this word, collective resources, because the private capital markets will not provide capital for these kinds of projects on their own. So we need public financing. There are different ways of doing this. Our proposal is that electricity ratepayers should be contributing to these innovations, whether in solar or wind. They already are, but if you look at the scale of the need, they need to be doing this on a larger scale. And so yes, I think there is a long answer to your question. Yes, there is a connection between these two things. We do need new schemes for financing the demonstration and early adoption of nuclear innovations, because the system that we have in place just isn't going to work. So quite a few. Okay, so here's a question.
David Cristaldi, retired biotechnology executive. Reading the popular press, one would conclude that the major obstacle to nuclear innovation is the societal safety question. And as you speak about these technologies that are under development, do you see, first, do you agree that that's a major issue for nuclear development? And if you do you see in the technologies that are at early stage development that have the potential for commercialization over the next 50 years or whatever the time period is, that can address the societal safety question in conjunction with the improved management systems, improved governance systems?
So on the first point, safety, of course, is a very important objective of innovators, improving safety, and I'll come back to that. But I actually wouldn't agree with the first point, which is the suggestion that the principal obstacle to nuclear development today is safety. In fact, the principal obstacle is that these plants just cost too much. They cannot compete with natural gas-fired combined cycle capacity with gas at $3 a million BTU. Nothing really can compete with that. And so that's what we're building. We're building lots of new gas-fired capacity around the country, and we're not building any nuclear. And a number of the nuclear plants that were kind of on the drawing board before the price of gas came down are now, no longer viable. There's just a few left. Some nuclear plants, in fact, are being closed down, the smaller ones, because they can't compete even as operating entities with low-cost natural gas. So actually the biggest obstacle today is economic. And unless we figure out a way to build plants that are less costly, and part of that is actually building smaller ones, because when you're a relatively small utility and you're looking at a $7 billion or $8 billion investment in a single plant, 1,200 megawatts, even if it were to be competitive on a levelized cost basis, it would be almost impossible to get any board of directors to bet the farm on a big project like that. So cost is key, and cycle time, as I said earlier, is key. But the second half of your question does one see in the next generation of reactor designs real advances in safety, performance? Whatever one views, whatever one thinks about the safety of the current generation of reactors, does one see significant advances? And I think the answer to that is yes. I think the answer to that is yes. We see a number of new developments, and we can go into more detail probably offline. We do see a number of new developments which go much further towards this goal of walk-away safety that I suggested might become a regulatory requirement 50 years from now. We see in some of these new technologies really substantial steps towards that goal, meaning, if an abnormal event happens, the reactor walk-away safety means the reactor shuts itself down and cools itself down without any intervention by operators or actively initiated, triggered, engineered safety systems. That's a characteristic of some of the reactors that are under development. The Chinese are probably at the forefront of the development of the so-called pebble bed, high temperature, helium-cooled gas reactor, the first full-scale module of which is going to come online within 2 or 3 years, so we're not that far away in that case. But there are other designs which are further away that also have, at least in principle, this characteristic of walk-away safety. So I think there is much promise here, even though I would not exactly agree with your first proposition, which is safety is what's holding things up now. Yes, sir.
So you read a lot in the sort of popular science press about the possibility of a thorium fuel cycle, as an alternative to the uranium cycle that we have now. I was just wondering if you could give your thoughts on that, where that stands, and if that's another possible nuclear fuel source for the future.
Well, it's certainly a fuel source that is generating quite a bit of attention. One of the reasons given for why we ought to be interested in thorium fuel cycles is that it is suggested that thorium fuel cycles would pose fewer risks of proliferation because uranium fuel cycles produce plutonium and thorium fuel cycles don't produce plutonium. However, thorium fuel cycles do produce uranium-233, which is a non-naturally occurring fissile isotope, just as plutonium-239 is. And as I look at the thorium cycles that are being proposed, it's not clear to me that the security advantages that that are suggested are that great, if indeed it's not even clear that they're even significant. Another advantage that is suggested for thorium-based cycles is that the waste, the composition of the waste is such that the lifetime, for the toxic lifetime of the waste will be reduced. Well, that's true, but it's a relatively small, it's not a qualitative change. We are still going to be left with quantities of long-lived nuclear waste, whether we use a thorium cycle or not. Probably the best argument for a thorium cycle arises in countries that don't have much uranium but do have lots of thorium. And that's true in India. And it's true it may even be true in China, but that's less clear. But it's certainly true in India. And that's why the Indians are investing quite a fair amount in thorium cycles. But for the United States to consider this seems to me, I mean, there's a range of views on this question, and I'm certainly not representing any kind of consensus within the field, but I don't see the benefits that would justify the switching costs, which would be very substantial from a uranium-based cycle to a thorium cycle. I think people...
We got one question over here, and why don't we make this one the last one?
Just a small clarification.
Yes.
At some point you say that switching from coal to gas is not sustainable. Did I hear you correctly?
You did. I did say that.
Okay.
So I probably was not as clear as I should have been.
And the second question, the nuclear fuel that is available worldwide, how large it is, how many years it may last?
Okay.
Can you repeat the question?
So the first question is, you said that the switch from coal to gas is not sustainable. Did you really mean to say that? And then the second question has to do with the supply, the availability, the long-term availability worldwide of uranium. So let me take the first question. I probably wasn't as precise as I should have been. We have seen a very big shift from coal-fired to natural gas-fired electricity within the last 3 or 4 years. Coal, which at the beginning of that period accounted for about 50% of our electricity, now accounts for less than 40%. I think it's something like 38%. And the reason for that is that natural gas, because of its decline in cost and also environmental advantages, has picked up the difference. It's not likely that that's going to change. And by the way, that shift over the last, let's say, even 2 or 3 years, has led to a very significant reduction in carbon emissions because coal-fired plants, on a unit of electricity produced basis, account for a little over twice the amount of carbon dioxide that a natural gas-fired plant yields. So that isn't going to, I don't think that's going to change unless we see a very dramatic increase in natural gas prices, which no one really seems to expect. Of course, people have been wrong about gas price projections before, but But no one really expects that. So I don't mean that that's not sustainable. What I did intend to say was that it's not likely that that rapid pace of substitution will be sustainable, because many of the coal plants that were shut down and replaced by natural gas were generally the old, least efficient, most polluting, the worst actors. And as we continue, you're now approaching, you know, the next plant to be replaced by natural gas is more efficient, more modern, less polluting, and so on. So even if natural gas prices stay where they are, and in fact there is some evidence of firming in those prices, it's not likely that we'll see the same continuation of the substitution and the shutting down of coal plants. Indeed, we're starting to see some plants that were shut down start to come back on as gas prices get a little stronger in some parts of a little firmer in some parts of the country. That's what I meant when I said it's not sustainable. On the question of uranium and the availability of uranium, this is a subject that we have studied at some length in our department. And our conclusion, and helped by others, it wasn't just my colleagues in the department, our conclusion is that even for the kinds of growth rates that are envisaged in charts like this, very rapid increases in nuclear deployment over this period, that throughout the rest of the century we will not be confronting uranium shortages. That the availability of uranium around the world at reasonable cost is such that even with rapid increases in nuclear capacity, we're not going to be running out of uranium. And so we don't need to be worrying about the thing that really drove much of the nuclear innovation efforts during the first few decades after the start of the nuclear era. It's a different world. And by the way, if in the end we do start to encounter serious shortages of uranium, it turns out that advances in the extraction of uranium from seawater are progressing in Japan and elsewhere, and projections of uranium price or cost of uranium recovery from seawater are now reaching the level at which the impact on total nuclear electricity costs would be relatively small. And so in that world, there is no issue with respect to uranium because there it is in the ocean, extractable by anybody who wants it at a cost. So we believe that the question of uranium shortages at this point can be taken off the table.
But if I may, in any case, it seems that we have 100 years of window to develop alternative energy sources. Am I correct?
Yes. And so yes, exactly. So on a sort of 100-year time frame, we were not able to discern a substantial threat in the form of scarce uranium.
No, I meant that to deplete the available sources of energy and switch to something new. We have probably 100 years window of opportunity to develop something else.
Well, I think perhaps I would put it a little differently. I think.
Can you repeat? We can't hear his question.
So maybe you should repeat it.
Okay. My question is, what will happen after 100?
After 100 years, what is going to happen? Because it seems to me that the existing sources of energy can be stretched up to, let's say, 100 years or 200 years. and then we have to find an alternative source of energy. That's how I.
Okay, I mean, I wouldn't disagree with that, but I would not be able to answer your question, what is it that is going to bail us out after 100 years? I have no idea.
What's wrong?
No idea.